Welcome to Redefine the Circle, a podcast where we discuss all things pitching. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. In this podcast, we're going to highlight topics that focus on how to maximize your pitchers now. We're going to discuss some of the trends that we've seen at S2 Breakthrough and talk about how we use data to create systems and training approaches that are specific to each pitcher. It's so important for us to continue to share this information and facilitate discussion within the pitching community so we can keep evolving as coaches and ultimately grow pitching into something it's never been before. Thanks so much for listening, and thanks for joining the quest to redefine the circle. Hi everyone, welcome back to Redefine the Circle. I'm Ashley Sunshine, co-owner and head of pitching development at S2 Breakthrough. This is our final episode in Series 5, where we are talking all about biomechanics and really the concept of roots versus symptoms. We've broken down a lot of different symptoms or strategies that pitchers use in the pitching motion, whether it's stride foot, whether it's glove arm positioning, arm path, and we've really looked at 4D motion sports to get a deeper look at what's going on with the trunk. What is actually the root breakdown that's occurring with these pitchers that's then leading to them using their levers the way they do. In this final episode, we are really going to talk about this concept of front side resistance, which I think is I just think it's really exciting because this is a concept, this is sort of like a term or a phrase that I think is thrown around a lot. It's been around for the longest time. There's so many drills that are really centered around having strong front side resistance. And I want to spend our time today talking about what is front side resistance? What are we even talking about as far as like how it's generated? What part of the body is being used to generate it? When it's not there, how do we create drills or environments to actually attack it? So this one I just think is like such an interesting concept, which I thought was really important to sort of end this series with this discussion. So to get started, let's revisit this question. What is front side resistance and what are we actually talking about? As usual, like what I've been doing in this series, we've been just following along on my computer quite a bit with high-speed video and 4D. So let's start with that. Looking over at my computer here, I'm going to get this pitcher rolling, and I'm going to first start with an example of what I feel is pretty good front side resistance. So what we can see, I'm going to get her all the way to landing, and what you can see here is that she's already being like setting herself up in position here. You can see with like a little bit of hike, this front side resistant concept. And so now as she lands and starts to rotate back with the upper body, there's something to absorb that force. And you can see she's pretty neutral in how she absorbs force. She would be an example, I think, to our eye where we would say she has good front side resistance. Okay, so now let's scroll over and actually take a look at her 4D. What is front side resistance? What does this actually mean? Here is what we see when we're looking at data, when we're looking at these graphs for pitchers, whether or not they have strong front side resistance or not, in this case, someone that does. As we talked about in previous episodes, we are looking at 3 planes of motion here. So this graph is specific to the pelvis. So we have rotation in red, the forward and backward movement in green, and then side to side or hike in blue. And really this is what we're going to be centering our conversation on today is this hike concept. So what we see in the pitching motion is that when we have this big bell curve here in green, this is a pitcher's load to start their motion. And when we get to this point where it gets back to 0, this means that she's gotten her posture back up to neutral. This is when she's essentially about to push off of the rubber, or in process, I should say, of pushing off the ground. And you'll see this like X, and this is where essentially the pelvis starts to unravel. We start to see that it starts to drive some rotation. We also start to see that it goes up in hike. So let's follow what we're looking at here. For a pitcher, remember, this is an example of someone who created strong frontside resistance. I want to show you what a graph would look like when that's being achieved. So we see that the pelvis is getting into this about 20 degrees, usually about 15 to 20, sometimes 25 degrees. That's really an appropriate range that we see at this peak. This usually occurs at the top of the arm circle. Basically, as the pitcher is now on one leg, she's in her stride, we're seeing that the pelvis goes into this hike position. That might seem like just self-explanatory, but you'll see that this is not always the case of what happens. What we'll see as she gets to the top of our arm circle, as she works down, we'll see a little bit of a dip in this blue graph. This will indicate when she gets that stride foot contact. So as the foot hits the ground, we lose a little bit of that max hike in the pelvis. And then whether or not we can sort of sustain, I always kind of think of it as like a little bit of a plateau through that stride foot contact point. So she got down to about 12 degrees. Usually when we're looking anything about at least 10 degrees or more, that we're still in decent position. So if she can sustain that through ball delivery, that is when then we're able to achieve frontside resistance. Whether or not this is able to sustain itself really comes back to whether or not the pelvis is controlled. So if you look at this green graph, this is like the posture plane. Look how close it stays to the 0 point, how steady it is. So for this picture in this example, as we're coming through, if I keep scrolling her through, you're gonna see she doesn't just plummet in that hike. At ball delivery here, she's gonna still be above 10 degrees. So she had this max at the appropriate point, came down within normal range as we would expect at stride foot contact, and then could generally sustain that through ball delivery because she had good, stable, pelvic control here through the end of the motion. That is actually what we're talking about when we're talking about frontside resistance. It's pelvic hike, and it doesn't get created halfway through the motion. This is something that generally is a relationship between whether or not the pelvis is in good enough position as we're transitioning from load to launch. When the pelvis is in good positioning and we push off the ground, then what happens is as it works to get back into extension, it was in that flexion position, remember, as it works to get back into extension, then it starts to drive in the other two planes. And so we saw that it was going down in red, which meant that it was starting to rotate. We also saw that it was going up in blue, which means it's starting to drive hike as she's going through that stride. So what essentially that graph was showing us is that the pelvis was really leading the stride, which is so important. That's an indication essentially that sort of like leaned back position. It's not coming from just the chest leaning back. It's not just coming from the stride leg, trying to spend more time in the air, whether it's through knee extension or really a lot of knee flexion to stay off the ground as long as possible. That it's coming from this ground up, pelvis is in hike, and then when she lands, there's enough pelvic control to sustain that and to absorb force at the end of the pitch. This series of Redefine the Circle is sponsored by 4D Motion Sports, the most powerful, portable, and affordable motion capture system. 4D motion sensors are used by the world's top sports professionals, and it's incredibly exciting to now have them for softball hitting and pitching. At S2 Breakthrough, every one of our athletes begins with an assessment process, which includes a biomechanics analysis using 4D motion sensors. The data is collected and available to read within seconds. It provides us with key metrics such as trunk stability, trunk rotation, as well as the timing and sequencing between the trunk and the arm. This is critical data for athletes and coaches to fully understand a pitcher's story and appropriately identify the root inefficiencies in her motion. The ability to fully maximize pitching performance metrics starts with understanding biomechanics, and there's not a more accessible and efficient way to quantify that story than through 4D motion sports. So that is frontside resistance. That is where it comes from, and this is what it looks like in a graph here with 4D motion. Let's now talk about some examples of when we do not see this. We do not see pitchers with strong frontside resistance and what their graphs look like. So coming back to the screen here, as I shift over, already after having looked at a good example, you probably noticed that this looks different. And so as we get this one rolling, what we'll see is that as this pitcher goes, you can see here's her 0 point. Here is where obviously rotation is going to start to drive, but we're not seeing that big spike in blue. It's a very minor spike. In fact, when it gets to its peak, we're getting close to the top of the arm circle. As I said, we're only at 7 degrees here. So remember, usually about 20, give or take, but about 20 degrees is what we're looking for here when we're ground up in launch, when we're using the pelvis, at the center of the body, the trunk is what's driving our launch. This is what we're seeing. So this pitcher essentially has nothing when it comes to pelvic hike. So that means that her pelvis is essentially neutral this whole time. So she's only at 7 degrees. When she gets to stride foot contact, which we know is going to be indicated by this little bit of this dip here in this blue graph, you can see she's at 2. There's nothing to hike here. So even though her pelvis is relatively stable, we don't see something crazy in the posture plane here. She just never achieved any hike. And so we're going to expect here that as we go through that this pitcher doesn't really have a good strategy or doesn't have an efficient strategy for absorbing force because the pelvis was never in position. This is not something that happened at the end of the motion. This is something that happened in the beginning of the motion here. And so let's take a look at her video. And so now we can see, what are we seeing with our eye? What happens with this picture that we're seeing? And so now we're not going to talk about whether or not she's sufficiently loaded. We're just going to talk about specifically what is her strategy for launch, since we know that it was not ground up, it was not really through the trunk led by the pelvis. And so right away in this motion, what's going to be so obvious right out of the gates is that this pitcher was not really, did not achieve good enough or sufficient force in the ground, didn't load the pelvis the way she, in an optimal manner, I should say. And this stride leg is going to be her strategy for creating launch. And this is pretty typical. We see this quite a bit. So she's really exaggerated in this stride leg. Let's follow this through. You can see how much sort of like how quad dominant this pitcher is. And so when she lands, if she had her shirt tucked in, remember at landing, we saw that this was like totally neutral. It was 2 degrees. So there's nothing there. So to no surprise, when she gets through the remainder of her motion, there's not front side resistance. You can see she has to rely on a lot of knee flexion to sort of try to absorb force, which is inefficient. She's going to lose a lot of energy that way because that hip hike was never there from the start. So for this picture in this example, it's really important to understand what we wouldn't want to do is to focus something at the end of the motion in order to create this, that her lack of front side resistance, which is actually her lack of hip hike, is that the launch itself, the transition from load to launch, was never actually rooted in ground through trunk. And that's how we attack that. And when we're looking at whether or not a pitcher is making progress with her ability to use the ground and use the trunk better, this would be a clear indication using 4D that she's obviously starting to make progress there. If we were starting to see that blue curve work up to numbers that are a little more in normal range. So that's that example. It's using the stride leg. It's not the only strategy that we see pitchers have. So when it's really quad dominant, that's not the only strategy that pitchers use, but it's really common. It's really common when you're seeing this like really quad dominant or the stride leg is doing everything. It's common, or it's probably a good assumption, I should say, that we're not achieving the hike from load to launch from in the pelvis that we'd like to see. And then as a result, frontside resistance is not going to be there at landing. So remember to always connect those two concepts, the beginning and the end. And so again, when the stride leg is like really dominating launch, it's probably safe to make that assumption that the hike's not there, and therefore frontside resistance or force absorption through that hip is just not going to be there as well. Okay, coming back to the screen here, we're going to look at another example of a pitcher that does not have strong frontside resistance at the end of the motion, and let's take a look at her graph, which is showing us what's going on. Here's this intersection. This is where she gets out of her load. She's back in a neutral pelvis. Now what happens as she gets out of this like hip flexion to hip extension? What goes on with the other planes? Yes, we're going to drive rotation, but let's see. We have her going up in hike, and how much? 7 degrees. This is identical to what we saw the pitcher before. So that is not going to be enough, because as she gets up to her max and we're going up to where she is at the top of her arm circle, because of where this pitcher, as she's losing posture. So remember how I kept mentioning this green graph, the more pelvic control you lose, the more then that essentially the other planes really start to go off the rails essentially. So whereas the other pitcher that we just looked at, while she also only achieved 7 at her max, she was at least able to sustain that through the top of her arm circle because she had pretty steady pelvic control in this posture plane. But for this pitcher, that's not the case. And so she actually gets down to 3 degrees by the time she's at the top of the arm circle. Remember, that's only going to go down even further as she hits the ground. So now we're at 2, and at ball delivery, essentially, we've got almost nothing. What I want to point out here is you might see that this is starting to go up again. And that might make you ask, like, hey, I thought you said you don't generate it again at the end of the motion. This is post-ball delivery. So this is long after the ball is gone. You'll see if you keep following that this graph will go up. And I included another 4D graph to show you why that happens. This is a behind view of the same pitcher. So the graph on the left is going to be that same pelvic graph I just referenced. And on the right now is the chest. So basically, because this pitcher does not have a good strategy to absorb force because of the reasons we just talked about, what will happen as she's coming down is watch in the chest, this big dip in blue here. This is also the hike plane, of course, in blue. And so watch how her chest really pulls this way. So as her chest is pulling that way, that's her strategy to make up for the lack of hip hike. And what's happening is essentially, as you can see, we're already at the peak in chest, not quite at the peak in blue yet. Basically, the pelvis is getting pulled with her as the chest is just trying to absorb force long after the ball is gone. So that's why we see this sort of like additional slope up or this additional bell curve here. But as this pitcher gets into ball delivery, we know that essentially she did not have the hike. We're here under 5 degrees here. And so this was a case of poor front side resistance. I included this video as well because I actually think this is a good visual as this pitcher comes through. As you can see, also a very stride leg dominant launch, clear to the eye. We've used this pitcher in other examples in our videos. She also uses the stride leg then to lead rotation, which is why we see some sort of like excessive femoral rotation. We've talked about that. And I think she's a really good example because as her shirt kind of separates from her pants a little bit here, it's very clear that you can see here in her waistline, like how neutral the pelvis really is as she lands. And so again, this is just a side video, but remember that big sort of like stiffness we see at the end, that was not actually coming from the pelvis. This is just the upper body now pulling to the side to try to absorb force, which is ultimately going to then pull this into hike. But that's not an efficient strategy because it wasn't rooted in hike. It wasn't rooted in what we talked about here from this transition from load, that the launch itself was coming from the trunk and more specifically from the position of the pelvis. So those are two examples of when things are not essentially, we're not seeing that front side resistance. And I just wanted to keep hammering essentially that, again, sometimes a pitcher is not achieving front side resistance and you don't see a quad dominant or stride dominant launch. That's not always the case. It's frequent that you do see that. That's kind of like a typical strategy, but it's not always the case. What I really want to make clear here, especially if you're not working with any type of like quantitative data when it comes to the trunk, something like 4D sensors, is to understand that when you see a pitcher struggling a little bit with front side resistance, what I can't drive home enough is that we don't want to focus on it as if it's something that just happens at the end of the motion. We have to understand the chain of events that comes before it, the kinetic chain that really led to that happening in the first place. It is a load to launch concept, whether or not we're ground up through trunk or whether or not we're just relying on a strategy which never actually changes the position of the pelvis. In these cases where the pitchers were using the stride leg, they were using a lot of knee flexion or hip flexion, I should say, where they're just like lifting up through those hip flexors. So they're essentially just like 90 degrees with the leg, but the pelvis is not actually changing. And that's what we saw there. So really just to help understand those concepts, remember something at the end of the motion is just a result of what happened early on. This is why we call movement and the pitching motion specifically a kinetic chain. It's the reason why we focus so much here at S2 Breakthrough on drills that are about being efficient in movement between load and launch, because we know that when you set up the chain of events correctly, you're much more likely, obviously, to unravel well throughout the motion. That when you're in the air, you're at the top of the arm circle, this is like the most difficult part of the motion, you are gonna likely lose some efficiency there. So we wanna go into that point as stable and as strong as possible, which is why, again, we focus so much on the beginning. Okay, as we're going back to my computer here, what I also want to show here is an example of someone that actually has, pretty good pelvic positioning, hike positioning, I should say. We're going to get her to this 0 point. She's coming out of hip flexion, starting to get into more of hip extension here. You can see rotation is about to drive in red. And we're also taking a look at this peak in blue. So as she gets to top of arm circle, you can see she's still going up. She's going to get to about 22 degrees, which again is within range of what we typically see as normal when you're using the ground well. So you can see it here in the avatar. It's really clear. She's in good pelvic hike. She's set up for good front side resistance. Little bit as she gets a little bit of a dip or a plateau as she gets to stride foot contact, which is what we typically see. And then what I want you to take note, I'm just going to finish this through ball delivery. Look how forward her upper body is, how much her chest is forward. And we see on the chest graph this big like loss of posture, this collapse of posture here in this green graph. And so what I also want to note is that even if at the end of a pitch, you may see that a pitcher is really like collapsed. We can't necessarily make the assumption that it was because she wasn't in the right position with the pelvis. In this case, the pitcher was in good position, but going back to sort of the start of her motion, we know for this pitcher, she's so chest-led, over 70 degrees of flexion. So much is being done out of her chest that it's leading the entire motion. There's something, obviously you're not gonna be able to see in this, but there's a little bit of an issue with slings here. I don't have a behind view or a video for this pitcher, but we talked about this, loading the wrong sling, which is why we see these go above 0. So the combination of being chest-led, her being in the wrong sling, what happens to this pitcher is that she has so much of an issue with like being in the wrong direction with her chest that it really collapses. And that's actually the root of that collapse. And so I wanted to show this example because, again, this was really not about pelvic positioning. This is really about sort of because of the direction of the load, which we talked about in previous episodes, that ended up being the root for this pitcher, which is why then it appears at the end that she doesn't have good force absorption or frontside resistance, but really it's about the direction in which she was launching and ultimately then how she had to pull in an opposite direction, and the chest then couldn't really be contained. So I think that's a really important concept. I think like we don't want to look at things in a vacuum. We don't want to necessarily just like, okay, we see her collapsing and just stay on that track. When I'm looking at someone's 4D and looking at their story, I want to just start at the beginning of the motion and just really start to look at, okay, I'm looking at this first checkpoint. Is she staying stable in all these planes? In the pelvis? Is she commanding that sagittal plane and load? We're not seeing a lot of hike or rotation. I would see from a behind view video in this case that pitcher is in the wrong sling and she gets launched, and she's a right-handed pitcher, to the left. So I would see that. And so that's important to note here, is that's the root issue of what's actually going on with this pitcher. Again, I can see in her 4D that the pelvis is in good position. It's a directional concept, and that attacking that is actually how you would attack her being able to be a little bit more upright in posture at the end of the motion. So this concept of front side resistance is it's not as simple as does she land and like stop? Like when she delivers the ball, does she just hit the brakes and we're in good posture and that's the end? We can't just assume that because someone is going forward that it's all because of the pelvis. We got to look at some of these deeper issues. And I just think this is it's a little bit complex, but it kind of shows you how important it is to really understand the full story from the beginning to the end. So I want this pitcher to clean up deceleration patterns at the end of the motion. We are talking about loading the right sling and launching in the right direction. That's where the root of the issue really occurs. The last thing that I really want to hit on, I have a high-speed video here, and it's so important to understand that in this whole series, the concept that I really want to drive home is that we can't just see something with our eyes and create drills that attack that specific position or that specific strategy at that time that we see it in the motion. We absolutely have to start recognizing that it is just the strategy or the symptom of what's happening much earlier in the motion, and that the levers, again, are at the mercy of the trunk. So if, for example, I'm sure most of us have either done a drill or seen a drill where we're like, we have to really focus on front side resistance. So we have a pitcher throw a pitch and then like push back, right? Because we're like, that is how we want her to feel what it's like to like post up. First of all, a couple things wrong with that. One, obviously, after delivery is not the time that we want to be able to like drive front side resistance. Now, obviously, that's today's discussion. We obviously should know that we don't create it at the end. We set it up in the beginning of the motion. So a lot of things wrong with drills that do that. They're never going to see translation into the actual motion when we focus on a pitcher just like posting up at the end of ball delivery. But what I also want to point out is if the pelvis is never in that position and you try to force a pitcher to like get into front side resistance, like post up, put the brakes on, you may actually, what she'll do is she'll drive that braking mechanism, that resistance from another part of the body that actually could be really putting her at increased risk for discomfort, injury, etc. Because again, you can't just force the pelvis to get into that hike position. It started way before that. So turning back to the computer, what I'm really showing here is a picture just from stride foot contact, a variety of reasons why this pitcher was not in good positioning. This is during her assessment process. She's not in good hike. Also one that you can kind of see just with her waistline here and her shorts, is she's really neutral in the pelvis. And so for her, whether or not this is just like a natural strategy or whether it's been like driven into her brain, like the intent is to post up, what she'll do, and what we often see, is that she'll use the knee to just hyperextend and to really like push back on in order to achieve that braking mechanism that she didn't have in the pelvis. So be very careful of this. This is not a position that we want our pitchers to get into that like big extension through the knee joint. That is not a healthy strategy for her to decelerate her energy. So to the extent that we are pretending as if something like hike or frontside resistance, however we refer to it, is something that occurs at the end of the motion. And if we ask our pitchers to think of it that way, they will create a strategy to do it, but it won't come from the right place. And oftentimes knee extension is the place where pitchers try to drive that. And that is obviously a problem for them. That's a problem for them. It's again, putting them at increased risk for discomfort, injury, etc. So as a whole, cannot emphasize this any stronger. Specifically for today's concept, it's about what's frontside resistance, what does it mean to hike the pelvis, where does that even come from, where do we start? But as a whole, in Series 5, the motion is a kinetic chain. That is not just like a buzz phrase. This is a concept that is so important to understand. What we see with our eye from a lever standpoint is just something that's being rooted off of what's going on with the trunk and something that's unraveling with the trunk. What we see at the end of the motion should not ever be fixed with a drill that concentrates on the end of the motion. Start at the beginning of the motion and start with the trunk and really understand and be able to communicate with your pitchers. We're going to be working on this phase of the motion, focusing with the intent to achieve this with our trunk. And when we're doing that well, we would expect to see X, Y, Z with this lever position, with this stride, whatever that may be, because they're related. Being able to understand that connection and communicate that with pitchers, that is really critical. And then being able to really just understand what you're going for, understand why they're training the way they do, why they're doing the types of drills or training in the environment they are. This root versus symptom concept is just something I think we just have to start doing a better job of as a pitching community between coaches, and certainly how we're communicating that with our athletes. Thank you so much for joining throughout Series 5. I hope you enjoyed the information. As always, feel free to send feedback, ask questions through any of our platforms, through social media, through email, etc. We love the discussion back and forth for all of the listeners and viewers who have followed Redefine the Circle. Series 6 will be launching in just a few weeks, and we are going to talk about specifically how to really combine this concept of understanding a pitcher's patterns using 4D and also connecting that all the way to her ball flight data. And specifically, what happens when someone has less than optimal patterns, but we're able to trace the story to understand that that pattern actually gives her something in ball flight that makes her special. So really making sure that we're not just trying to chase optimal patterns all the time, because when we know how it's helping her potentially in ball flight, chasing optimal patterns may actually be pulling back on what makes that pitcher great. This is something we deal with a lot when we're looking at older pitchers, older in high school, college level athletes for sure. I think it's such an interesting and a complex discussion, so I'm really looking forward to having that series kick off in just a few weeks. Between now and then, as always, continue to quest on to redefine the circle. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to today's episode. I'd love to connect and hear your feedback. You can contact me directly at ashley@s2breakthrough.com. If you're listening, you can leave us a review, or if you're watching, go ahead and leave a comment below. Also, be sure to follow S2 Breakthrough on all of our social media channels and subscribe to Stream S2 to find all things player development. Until next time, quest on.